thanks everyone. Today I'm presenting my work about reaction network and autocatalysis. So in one word, what I've done is to do a framework of a ODE and ODE, where I use the reaction network topology to construct another DDE. So ODE is n dimension and the DDE is one dimension. And these two systems will have the same Lyapunov exponent or long-term growth rate. And why we are doing this? Because analyzing one-dimensional DDE sometimes has advantage over analyzing ODE. And I will elaborate that in the later part of the talk. So first, I would like to acknowledge that there are many growing systems in nature, including cell biology, ecology, and even economy. And in this study, what we mean growing system means the amount of things are growing. It's not the node of the network. So the network topology are fixed. Okay, this is the same amount of species, same number of species, and same number of industry. But each node can increase, which means each of the species among the number of eagle or the fly is increasing. And that's what I mean growing things. And usually when we talk about growth, in physics, there's already several models about how to describe system growth. So the most basic model in physics is static equilibrium or steady state. In these two cases, the growth rate is zero because the influx and efflux are exactly canceled out. In equilibrium, influx and efflux are reverse reactions, so they are in detailed balance. But also you can have not reversible reaction, but everything is balanced. For example, actin polymers has two ends, so it can increase by one end and decrease by the other end, and you have a treadmilling. Or chemical reaction flux, which has energy input, can also reach steady state, but the system has zero growth rate. But other than that, beyond this, we can really have a system which is increasing its size, which means the influx is bigger than the overall efflux, and the system will increase its biomass. This happens in our economy and in many mathematical models in metabolism, and also some protein partition model in the cell biology. And in all this, including the economy model, people assume the growth is balanced, which means all the metabolite in the system reach some constant concentration. But actually, in reality, the real cell and real metabolism is more complicated because the metabolite when the system increasing, the metabolite concentration can also increase, and it can also oscillate. So we will need a more general model about the growing system. So this is some experimental work that for the rod-shaped bacteria like E. coli, when we culture it in a nutrient-abundant condition, the number of the cell will grow exponential. But in microscopy, we see the length of the cell here also can grow exponentially. And this can be verified. Like if we stop the cell division, you can sometimes get very long cells. But when the cell get very long, you see the length increase exponentially. So exponential growth is kind of like a very general phenomenon in nature, and this will be the topic of today's talk. So let's start our basic model. We have environment and systems, and environment has several nodes. System has several nodes, and between this node there are reactions. So I will call X as the biomass vector, and if the system is growing, X can be unbounded in ODE solution. So we are studying unbounded ODE. And the flux, when the system gets growing, the flux can also be unbounded. And the reaction between flux and the nodes are connected through this storage geometry matrix. So this is in general a nonlinear unbounded ODE. But since the system gets bigger, sometimes we want to consider system size, which is the total amount of X, and also the rescaled system, because when the system gets bigger, you can rescale by the system size. So you get Yi, where Yi is between 0 and 1, is a fraction of the biomass in specific node. Or if you think this is a growing ecosystem, Yi is the fraction of the species happening in this ecosystem. And then the long-term growth rate is defined as dN over dt average for a long time. So our question is, when will this long-term growth rate exist? Because this is a nonlinear ODE. So let's start with the simpler case, which is the linear ODE. So we have a linear function in this form. And for linear ODE, because the chemistry impose constraint that it need to be upstream limited, which means the xk here is an upstream node, and it will have a linear amount of flux go to, so biomass will be transferred into this downstream node in a linear function. So in this case, there's no way to have two upstream nodes because it need to be proportional to one of the node. Okay, so linear system will have exponential growth because this can be written as the solution can be written as a matrix exponential way, and it will be, and lambda, the long-term growth rate, will be one of the eigenvalue. What I'm going to do next is to generalize the linear system to a homogeneous of degree 1 system. So this is more relaxed and this is more nonlinear, but this will allow us to have multiple nodes on the upstream. So homogeneous degree 1 means if you times everything by twofold, then the entire system will also grow by twofold. One of the example is here. If I have upstream node x1 and x2, like this nonlinear flux function, I can rewrite this one as a prefactor as a a1y times x1. So this will be upstream limited by x1. But the same function I can also rewrite in terms of another prefactor and the x2, which means this flux here will be limited both x1 and x2. And this function still scale with the system. And this is what I call a scalable flux. So in the following, scalable flux will mean not homogeneous of degree 1 plus upstream limited. So there are many scalable flux functions, including all the linear function and many nonlinear functions, such as things like sigmoidal function. It can even has oscillatory functions. And in economy, it also happened in the Solon-Swan model and the Cobb-Douglas function, if you are familiar with economy. So what can we do about the scalable flux is, in the previous work, I proved that the scalable flux, you can decompose the ODE into one-dimensional radial dynamics plus n-1 dimension simplest dynamics. So in short, that when the system can scale, you can keep rescaling the system such that all the dynamics is described in this n-1 simplex. So originally we have unbounded growth, but then we can, by normalizing this, the growth dynamic become confined in a bounded space. So the convergence of long-term growth rate become like, if we have scalable condition and we have ergodic condition for the trajectory, then this long-term growth rate will exist. And we can calculate the long-term growth rate by studying this normalized system, not the original system. Because the normalized system is bounded in the simplex, it will be easier to study. So to summarize, we try to analyze unbounded ODE using the scaling property. So we are studying a special type of ODE, have this scaling property. And then this allows us to study the long-term growth rate. So now I'm going to go to the main topic is the next finding is how to study biomass transfer on a reaction network. So so I want to borrow an idea from fluid dynamics. So in fluid dynamics, we have two perspectives, Eulerian and Lagrangian. So Eulerian trajectory is you have an absolute coordinate, and you look at this absolute and counting how many influx and efflux. Lagrangian is you have a relative coordinate, you travel with a fluid parcel, and then when the fluid moves, you study how this fluid parcel deform and move. But in reaction network, actually, we can have the similar analogy. You can focus on one node and study biomass come in and come out, go out this node. This will be influx and efflux for biomass. But also, if you assume the biomass is conserved, you cannot destroy mass. You need to go to a certain node, and you can track this mass. Then you can have also a Lagrangian perspective for the biomass to move. And then you can write down Markov process. And then in certain cases, you can convert this into DDE. And this is what the motivation I'm doing this. So in short, what I do is I will convert the ODE and discretize. First, I discretize it into a Markov process. So Markov process will have this probability R, K, A, Y, which K is the upstream node, Y, X, Xj is another downstream node, and A is a certain reaction. So this reaction rate will be quantified, only depends on the relative fraction of Y. And this Markov property will allow us to write down the DDE. I will tell you how to write down this alpha and beta in the DDE model. But before the very complicated things, I would like to come back to a subject about autocatalysis, because this is about the autocatalysis and reaction network. So how does this connect to autocatalysis? So one of the things, when we have a complex reaction network, and we talk about reaction network growth, all we need to do is to know that the influx need to be bigger than the efflux. So the biomass will be accumulated. So the influx here, because we assume scalable flux, will be controlled by some, this boundary influx will be controlled by some node. And this node xg, I will call it the gatekeeper node. So which means, for example, in this model, you have x1, 2, 3, and these three flux will be limited by these three. So what I need to study is to study x1, 2, 3. If they grow exponentially, then the entire system will grow in the same rate as exponential rate as the entire whole. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on the gatekeeper node, which limit the boundary influx of the system. So the gatekeeper node, you can think then, is like using the entire system to amplify themselves. It promotes the biomass to enter the system, which is the amplification process. And then once the biomass enter, it takes several steps and reach the gatekeeper node. And there's a delay in the time. And this is what I call delay process. So let me give you one simple example. This is a system with n node x1 to xn. And the xn will promote more biomass entering this system with rate b. So this entire system is a linear system. We can write it as a matrix equation. And with the Eulerian view, we can solve the long-term growth rate by eigenvalue problem. So this is like very straightforward. But as example, we can also analyze the same system using a Lagrangian view. So in this case, this will be resembled as an ecology model where there are multiple stage of organism. For example, this adult organism will be xn. It will consume a nutrient from the environment and produce X. So this is like an amplification process. After this X will undergo multiple waiting stage and then regenerate xn. And this will have an exponential growth too. So let me illustrate how to write this simple system in DDE. So the key things is we want to write Markov relation between the first influx, boundary influx, J0, versus the latest, the last influx, Jn-1. So these two influx is related by the transfer time from x1, x2 to xn. So there's a waiting time here. So the waiting time, we will call it h. So the Markov relation is that if you have a lot of influx at time 0, after a certain time, it will reach xn and amplify itself in the future. But the last flux is actually dxn1 over dt. Okay, and the first flux, by our definition, is xn. So which means because these two, we can have a DDE just for xn, and this become one-dimensional DDE. And the h, this delay time kernel, I will call it arrival function, is a convolution of many exponential waiting time here. And then amplification b also enters here. So here I can write dx over dt is proportional to this integral of xn convolution with alpha. And I also prove that the long-term growth rate will satisfy this relation, where A, capital A, is the Laplace transform of this alpha. Okay, so let me do a concrete example how to do this. So suppose we have three systems, very similar. The first system, it will autocatalysis immediately. There's no waiting time. Second system, when the biomass enter, need to wait one time from X1 to X2. And the third system, when they enter, you need to do 2 steps in order to reach the gatekeeper. And intuitively, the first one will have the highest growth rate because it doesn't need to wait. And the second and third one, you need to wait longer time. So to do this, we can write down the waiting time distribution, and it's Laplace transform. And we can solve, I can plot this Laplace transform, what I call the catalytic spectrum. And because we have this equality, we can actually solve the lambda using a geometric method. That because lambda is this diagonal line, and then capital A lambda is this decay of Laplace transform. Their intersect will correspond to the lambda 1, 2, 3 of these 3 models. So we can see that lambda 1 indeed has the highest growth rate because it has no waiting time. Lambda 3 need to wait longer, and then therefore the total autocatalysis process is slower, and it has a lower growth rate. So these models are nice, but why do we need?
Sorry, can I ask you a quick question on the previous slide?
Yes.
So, sorry.
Yes.
Yeah, on the previous slide.
Yes.
Yeah. So, A1, is that just the rate constant?
A1 because the waiting time is delta function. It's like no waiting time. So yeah, it's a constant function.
I see. I was just wondering, your waiting time, why is it not are you assuming mass action kinetics or not? Because I would think it's something like A1 times, the concentration of X1 that you have, or something like that in the
yeah, the flux is mass action. The flux is small a. And the alpha is the delay, and then the capital A is the Laplace transform of alpha. So the mass action comes here as a flux function.
Perfect. A1 is the flux. Okay, I'm on board. Thank you. I thought it was just a constant, so I was just confused. Okay.
Okay, thank you. So okay, let me go back. So we have 2 models now can solve lambda, the long-term growth rate. One is ODE, very simple, finding eigenvalue. The other is DDE, need a little bit time, but also find the same answer. But why do we need? So I would want to advocate that in DDE, it's facilitate us to understand coarse graining of the system. So we all learn this electric circuit, you can have equivalent resistance. So one of the questions is, if we have a reaction network, can we equivalent the network with a simpler one and then study the simpler one? And this is open question. So, but if we study the scalable network, we can actually have an answer. And the answer is, you can never equivalent this multiple stage network with a single one. And the reason is the waiting time distribution of multiple stage cannot be equal to any waiting time distribution of single step. So the coarse graining will not work in this framework, but luckily we can have an upper bound and lower bound for the coarse graining, which means if you have a complicated network, I can construct 2 networks, one as your upper bound, the other as your lower bound. And the growth rate will be bounded by these 2 models. So these 2 models are relatively simple because I already analytically solved here. So this allows us to analyze if one day I have a very complex network, 100 nodes, can I roughly estimate what will be the long-term growth rate using a simpler model, using a coarse grain model? And also if my network is perturbed by a small amount, how much the lambda will be perturbed? This kind of question will be easier to study with this spectrum versus study a 100-dimensional matrix. Yeah, so I think the DDE has some of the usefulness in a more qualitative study about the growing system. So the summary, we study a flux generalized from linear flux to this scalable flux. So this generalization is here. The prefactor is y. Depends on y, only depends on relative fraction, and then it's proportional with upstream node xk. And sorry, in this kind of flux, the Markov transition rate will be R of y. It will depends on the system state. But in the long term, we were able to construct a DDE and get a time-independent kernel. So in the end, the last part, I need to tell you how do I write down explicitly for the alpha and beta here. And I think due to the time limit, I will briefly go through the talk, and everything is on the archive now. So the thing is, again, okay, now we have a real network, not just one line, one transition, but a very complex network. We can have multiple gatekeeper here labeled in the yellow. So we sum up the gatekeeper biomass. Okay, summing up the gatekeeper biomass, and then we need to construct a DDE based on this Z. The first step is to counting how many pathways we have from the environment to gatekeeper. So in this case, we can have three categories. First, reaction pathway is from environment, hit the gatekeeper node. Second category is to recycle from gatekeeper and go to the other part of the system and come back. And the third category is from the internal to the gatekeeper node. And only the first category 1 and 2 will contribute to the long-term growth rate. So for example, in this simple reversible model, the first heating pathway from environment to the gatekeeper will have infinite time. It can come to x1, x2, and then do some loop here, like back and forth, and then hit x3. So we have infinite countable pathway. And from G to G, it's like if I start x3, I can come to x2. I can also go between x1 and 2, and then go back to x3. So we can also include all these different pathways. And different pathway will have different probability, which we're going to weight it in our summation. So the way we write alpha is to summing up all the pathway I just mentioned with this amplification, which is the amplification of the first step, and the arrival function, which is the conditional waiting time going to certain pathway. And the conditional waiting time can be calculated by a Chapman-Kolmogorov equation. But for linear system, if we converge to fixed point, it can be further simplified. And the second thing is I need to describe how to write beta. So in this case, beta is the biomass go out of the gatekeeper G. So it has a relative complex expression, but you can intuitively say, no, this is the overall gatekeeper flux rate, excluding transition within G. So once we write this alpha star and beta star, the last step is to perform ergodic average of these two quantities. And the reason is for nonlinear system, you are not only converge to fixed point, but you can also converge to, for example, limit cycle here. And if you go to limit cycle or other more complex attractor, you have an ergodic measure on this attractor. And to get a time-independent quantity of alpha and beta, you need to perform a proper ergodic average in this case. And I proved that the proper ergodic average for beta is very simple. It's just average with respect to the invariant measure. But for the alpha, you need to weight it with this delay of z, and that will be the proper average. So the last part is I briefly show you that if we have a scalable system and we focus on the gatekeeper node, we can construct all the pathway from the environment to the gatekeeper node, and the gatekeeper recycle to gatekeeper node, and we can write down a DDE by summing up all the pathway. And eventually we have the same formula, which is the growth rate and degradation rate will equal to the catalytic spectrum at the growth rate. I believe this has some meaning in biology, that when the cell tries to autocatalysis itself, it has a spectrum of exponential catalysis and delay. And this spectrum will, when it's go to the long term, this spectrum will need to be equal to the growth rate and the degradation rate or dilution rate when we talk about microbiology. And I think this has some implication in the future. So I want to summarize that using a reaction network is a very natural setup for DDE, because if you think of biomass, transition on this network, it will have naturally generate delay. So this delay kernel can be used to study the reaction network. And this model here, dz over dt, of this integration is different from the classical renewal equation, because in the past, the z outside this is zt, okay? this model has been a renewing model has been studied for a very long time, but this first derivative equal to the convolution hasn't been studied that much. So I'm happy if anyone knows some literature already studied this similar kind of DDE, I can include in my manuscript. And thank you. And this is my current group in academia, Sinica, Taiwan. And I'm happy to take questions.